The man who can answer that question is walking right up here right now.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Joshua Vincent. I've been here a few times regaling you with stories of Georgism, and I'm really glad. Where did Steve go? What? Oh, there he is. I'm really glad to see him. I'm glad that you came down. And I can let you know that the land value tax is used in 20 cities and school districts and a business improvement district in Pennsylvania. It's used in Kauai County in Hawaii. And most towns and cities in New Zealand and Australia, almost all the states of Australia are either have a land tax or are moving rapidly towards it. Denmark did have it, and I think they got rid of it. It was such a minuscule part of their tax, they thought that it would be best to go to an income tax on localities. I think they'll regret that. Finland, however, has filled in the gap. They've just adopted the municipal land value tax. And it's really popping up all over the world. Singapore and Hong Kong are great models. There are variations of a tax system. In Hong Kong and Singapore, the government owns most, if not all, of the land, and they rent it out. Or if you're in Singapore and and they decide to build a transit extension, like we were just talking about, into New Jersey Transit, bringing you out there, then the increase in the value of the land is collected to pay for it. So you're not hitting the people with taxation. Taiwan certainly is a great example, and I could go on. Now, usually what I do is I talk about the brass tacks of LBT, how to do the single tax or the single tax limited or two rate, whatever they call it, and how the efforts are moving in the world and in the United States. I was asked to go to Puerto Rico, however. The process started about 2.5 years ago when we met some legislators from the Assembly, from the legislature of Puerto Rico at the Conference of the National State Legislatures. And the state legislatures from all over Canada, the US, South Africa, Australia. As a side note, the Australian legislators were great because they came to our booth. We had a little exhibition booth, and they went, this is what we do. And the Speaker of the Australian House actually stayed at our booth for about an hour and a half, regaling visitors and Lindy Davies and myself, who were staffing the booth, about how well it works, and you'd be crazy not to do anything else, and he was a great addition to the show. What I'm going to talk about, though, is this connection with the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, and naturally we think that this is going to be about a storm or about a hurricane, and instead it's a long, drawn-out nightmare for this island. And I'm not talking about the extermination of the indigenous peoples. I'm not talking about the exploitation of the survivors and the slaves that the Spanish brought in. That's in the history books. We're well aware of it. And we'll let the Spanish deal with that. That was their fault. But at some point, it became our fault being the United States of America, who through the best intentions and the worst intentions both screwed up a lovely place that is geographically suited to success for its people, for its land, and for its culture. And that hasn't happened, and I'm going to try to find out why by using a bit of Georgism and a bit of plain old history lecturing. And I don't think I'll go on too long. I think I have about 20 minutes from what I recall. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So an Island Marooned. That's supposed to be funny, and it really isn't. But this is a story that can't be told in 20 minutes. but I'm going to try to do as good a job as I can and tie it into what we're talking about and tie it in with our efforts with the Puerto Rican government and Puerto Rican municipalities and people and academics, because the Puerto Rican government is, I think, probably one of the worst elected governments that I've ever had the displeasure to work with. They don't care about who they rule, and as we saw from the fall of Governor Rosello, they were outright condescending and disdainful of business owners, workers, their very own constituents. So we start with, of course, 1898, when civilization, quote unquote, kicked in the door of the tottering Spanish Empire and gave us, as you can see there's Columbia, gem of the ocean, there's Uncle Sam, God bless him and love him, and here are the poor benighted Cubans, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico, saying thank you for coming, thank you for saving the day. It's around 1898. So in the early years, the military and quasi-military authorities ran Puerto Rico as a military base and a colony. The real reason that we took Puerto Rico and wanted it badly is because it fit into the new strategic thinking of Alfred Thayer Mahan, who essentially adopted the philosophy that if you wanted to rule the world, all for the best intentions, that if you wanted to rule the world, you had to rule the oceans. And Puerto Rico at the time presented a perfect location for coaling stations. At the time, Navy ships had to stop at various places and get coaling stations. Around this time also, the newly sprung German Empire wanted to get coaling stations as well. And so that's where the start of geopolitics, as we know them today, really came about, thanks to Admiral Mahan's book. What we did is some good stuff. We built, as a country and as the government, infrastructure, roads, railroads. We connected the north and south part of the island. We brought rudimentary forms of citizenship to the Puerto Ricans so that they could enjoy the benefits of being part of this new empire. And they did a fairly good job, and it was because it was the military, I think. They had a lot of single taxers in the military, which a lot of us really aren't aware of. But a lot of these Henry George followers really helped turn around places that were in big trouble, either through our actions or somebody else's. The role of Douglas MacArthur after World War II in bringing about Japanese land reform can be laid directly at the feet of the West Point instructors who taught the single tax as a way to renovate, rehabilitate, and rejuvenate shattered economies and defeated enemies. It worked. So by the time the 1930s came around, there was some local autonomy as far as people being able to get some help in staying farmers, keeping their land. In the 1930s, this is another alphabet department of FDR, and it was devoted to preserving smallholding in farms. And instead of letting the former grandees from Spain, who of course stayed on, to prevent them from stealing the land that had been distributed by the United States. So you had essentially this small family farm kind of set up, and it worked as well as it did for a while. But of course, small family farms in the practical scheme of things, they don't bring you wealth, they bring you a subsistence. And sometimes that's just fine. I wish I lived on a self-sustaining farm. So when we move on from the 1930s, and I'm going to do a lot of jumping here, we had an emptying of the rural population. You can see what it was in the, this is how far back my numbers go. It goes back to about 1950, and that's the share of population that lived on farms. So essentially, by getting rid of the first aid program and bringing in other programs and tax credits, the rural population essentially was driven down to almost nothing. Everybody went to the cities and everybody got jobs thanks to bootstraps, Operation Bootstrap, which you probably read about in high school, and it was very much touted as a successful way to uplift the people of Puerto Rico by the government. Puerto Rico offered, as you can see in this PR piece, FLAC piece, you can mail in a coupon there to get your information on how to open up your own factory in Puerto Rico, and you don't pay taxes on it, period, end of story. And that helped the city, the Commonwealth, the island, move away from an agricultural economy based almost entirely on sugar. And sugar is what it is. You're never going to get any richer out of it. You're not going to produce any more of it. And by the time the 40s and 50s rolled around, states like Louisiana were producing more and higher quality sugar. And of course, we put up tariffs, and the sugar tariffs are they're the only thing that keeps the Louisiana and Florida sugar growers alive. But getting the folks into towns was now policy. And this policy lasted from the 50s to the 70s, and people were employed. That's when San Juan became a very nice place to live for people as well as for visitors and as well as for businesses. There were lots of pharma companies, lots of manufacturing taking place, but the rub that was always there is this was a sugar high, ironically enough. By taking away the sugar, we artificially inflated the economy by eliminating taxation, corporate taxation, in Puerto Rico for some years. And interestingly, it came from President Carter to put in the program of 636 as a way of, jump-starting the economy. Maybe a generation later, President Clinton got rid of it. Now, Operation Bootstrap, as we can see, people had jobs. It looks like a pretty nice factory, no different from Waterville, New York, near where I grew up. And the problem is that once there were no more farms, and then the tax exemption stopped, thanks to President Clinton's policy of withdrawing this tax benefit called 936, there was no more industry. That is the rate, the numbers of employment, I should say, from 1990 to just about today. So industrial employment ended. Now, people couldn't go back to the farms. Once you've left a farm, it's really hard to get back into the groove. It's hard work, and you like having sewage and roads and schools. So things really became tense and have remained tense. And in 2005 is when the final elimination of that tax subsidy program kicked in. And that's when the bottom fell out and has stayed out since then until this day. Corporations fled. The only people that were left working were people employed by the government, because that's the only way they could keep employment up, is to work for the government. And they did all kinds of things for the government, or they did no things for the government, but they were getting a paycheck. And it was a slice and dice game of getting money from Washington. But more important than that, Puerto Rico was given a hand grenade from the federal government. And this was their ability to issue local, school, municipal, and Commonwealth municipal bonds, all of which were exempt, which is pretty unique. It is unique in the United States. So they're called triple tax exempts. And of course, people that issue bonds are thrilled with that. There's going to be a great return. And if you can keep that sugar high going, then you can still fund the schools, fund the government, and expand the home economy, while at the same time getting all these wonderful bonds from Wall Street and beyond. So 936, as I said, had a drastic effect on the people and government of Puerto Rico. These are some good examples. This is when the tax break 936 was phased out and employment just plummeted. Now, this was good manufacturing work. A lot of skilled engineers, a lot of skilled labor was involved. And if you go over to this one right here, you see the job losses in Puerto Rico cratering. Meanwhile, employment kept rising after 2006, and after the recession ended, it went back up. And the labor force has increased. It went down, of course, during the recession in the country, in the mainland, but in Puerto Rico, the labor force has almost vanished to nothing. And the loss of meaningful employment, these high-tech jobs, was crushing, because the people that couldn't handle it are people that could do what, as Americans, they have the right to do. They moved to Florida, they moved to the mainland. These are the people that could do things, these are the people that fix things, that maintain roads and infrastructure. So the biggest beneficiaries, so far as I can tell, of previous government policy towards Puerto Rico are people in Florida and Georgia and North Carolina and New York City, who didn't have to spend a penny to get all these wonderfully educated and motivated people. And they've left the island. The people that are left are either very young or quite elderly, and they're not being well educated. Public debt, because of the bonds that I was talking about, skyrocketed, and it skyrocketed to the degree that no other American state is even close. I think that's, yeah, Rhode Island is up there, and Rhode Island is supposedly a basket case. But that's the outstanding public debt of Puerto Rico up top. The numbers don't work, and if nothing had happened weather-wise with Puerto Rico, they would still be in a terrible position. They have tens of billions, about $100 billion in debt that can't be paid off. And every governor, up until the one that was just run out of office, said, well, you know, we can't pay it back. And usually those sad songs are a plea to help bail us out. And it didn't happen. The commission that was formed to deal with this really worked only for the bond issuance people, the Wall Street people, the hedge funds. So as the debt increased, the agreement in, I think it was 2012, the agreement was that we would pay off, the Puerto Rican people would pay off their debts by capitalizing the sales tax. Now, in a country that's essentially pretty poor, a sales tax is about the worst tax you could impose, because it's very regressive and it falls very heavily on poor people, and especially on people that are living their everyday lives. Sales taxes are, as Georges would say, they're as pernicious as they come. They're as bad as the income tax. And so the consumer price index, because of this inflation of sales tax receipts, has been nothing but crawling up. Remember, this is all while a hurricane has hit, that the consumer price index has skyrocketed. So paying off the bondholders, what else do you do? Well, you raise taxes, of course, and you raise taxes on the people that can least afford to pay it. But you also, what can you do with that costs a lot of money? Schools. These are the schools that were closed in the past 3 years in Puerto Rico. So the future of Puerto Rico, its children, the future of any society, its children, essentially is SOL, what the technical term is, shoot out of luck. And you can see that in the rural areas, they're very poor indeed. The school closings, and these are pre-K all the way up to 12K. just have been shut down about 60%. And that wouldn't be so bad, but if you're going to get out of poverty, you've got to be educated. That's the way it goes. And the distribution of people living in poverty means that you're cutting any way out for the people of Puerto Rico, except for leaving Puerto Rico. So it's a real tragedy. And then the final tragedy, no, it's not the final tragedy, I could go on for 4 hours, is something called the Jones Act. Has anybody heard of that? The Jones Act is one of the single most pernicious pieces of legislation ever passed by the United States or any other government. It means that if you want to export your goods, say it's rum, say it's sugar, widgets, if you want to export from Puerto Rico, you have to have a U.S. flagged ship that is manned, or I should say, is employing only American U.S. sailors and can only travel to U.S. ports. So, suppose Switzerland says, you know what, we want to import your X. They can't without paying huge duties. So by law, we've made Puerto Rico unable to trade with anybody except for Big Daddy Sam, Big Uncle Sam. So the costs are, and I don't like to use the word colonial relationship, but that's just what it is in this case. Hawaii suffers under the Jones Act as well, still. And Guam suffers under the Jones Act. And we had a chat this year at the National Conference of State Legislatures, and there's now a caucus that is mostly overseas territories that are fighting the Jones Act. And the Jones Act is supported by the slimmest of constituencies, shipbuilders and shipping line owners. I could go to Greece and find 75 freighters in 5 minutes to replace the ones that have to be used here. And that's why we have the Philadelphia shipyard, which is heavily subsidized to assist the American shipbuilding and shipping industry. The Jones Act makes it incredibly expensive for Puerto Ricans to power their economy. Now, it's got no natural resources. Where are they going to get their oil? Well, they have to get it from outside. 5 minutes. I'm almost there. So if you think about it, the supply of oil, which is still tough, you have to bring it over, you have to drop it off, it has to be done on American ships. So it makes the expense of basic power incredible. And of course, there are no subsidies and there's no allowances for what they have most of: water power, sun power, and air power, wind power. There's no industry that can go in there because of protectionist policies. The one thing that they could be self-reliant on. Now we'll get to today, and the storms caused $96 billion in damage, and that has to be paid for in addition to the $100 billion that's outstanding debt. And it's not just houses and hotels. This is it. This is the bloodstream, the ephemeral artery of any mountainous island are good roads, good access, good transit. These roads are, this was taken 6 months ago, years after the hurricane. They're not getting fixed, and nothing can happen. There's no money coming in, and nothing can happen without fixing that infrastructure. So, to wrap up, the current bond debt and unfunded pensions are about $125 billion in a place where the median income is about $26,000 a year. How are you going to pay that off? There is no guaranteed revenue stream to rebuild the infrastructure except for writing nice letters to President Trump and Congress. The Commonwealth government itself is looking pretty good, but what they have done financially is they've cut off all aid that used to traditionally go to municipalities and cities. So there's no money to pick up the trash, there's no money for schools, etc. Pardon me?
So where does it go? I mean, if they have,
The money goes to paying off the people that hold the notes.
Sorry.
Yeah, they come first. And that's a terrible message, but that's it. And municipalities cannot raise their own revenue. They have no legal way to do so. This is where we come in, the Henry George people. And the cost of basic needs, such as energy, export facilities, and the Jones Act makes life very expensive. It's, you would think that wouldn't happen. So our ideas, and this is what we're working on right now, with mostly, as I said, academics and municipalities, is the Commonwealth government, they're really concerned about holding on to their own, which is, that's the story of human history. So we believe that investment in public infrastructure can sustain itself. That we have to get the seed money, that's a problem, but it can sustain itself by value capture, land value capture, which is one of the tenets of what we believe in. If the government builds it, no they didn't, the taxpayers, you and me, we built it. And the same for Puerto Rico. By lowering taxation on the things that Puerto Rico needs, which is markets and wages, we have to do that, they have to do that. Whatever is taxed is reduced in amount, except for land, of course. And so it's cheaper, the minimum wage is higher in Puerto Rico than it is in Florida. So go to Florida even and work at a Hardee's. And the axiom does not apply, of course, to land. They ain't making any more of it, even in Puerto Rico. So zoning is a fetish amongst planners in Puerto Rico. And zoning changes land values dramatically and locks people out of areas, it locks businesses out of areas where they ought to be. And luckily, when we went down there, the Puerto Rican, they're called CREAM, it's the local, not local, it's the Commonwealth Assessment Authority, has decided to reassess all of its property and its land registry, which hasn't been done since 1956. So it's just a big screw up, or a cock up, as our British friends would say. And so changing the assessments will really help, because some of the nicest hotels that you might have seen in San Juan on the Condado that probably bring in $70 million a year, $100 million a year gross, they pay taxes on about $10,000 to $100,000 of value, and that's each hotel along the shore. The values are so old, and their tax bills are nothing. So I think in the end, and this is an ongoing story, that the land value tax may serve as the source for payment in lieu of taxes revenues from institutional and governmental property owners. More and more people have just abandoned their property. And so what the government has to do, the duty of government, is to take back the land. And I know that the anti-taxers up in the hills of Montana won't like that, but the land belongs to the community and nobody else. So if nobody's paying taxes on it, take it. Take it and rent it out, and you'll get some action. So I want to thank you. It was kind of gloomy, and I know it wasn't supposed to be gloomy, but this is an emergency. It won't go away. It's lasted for 100 years. And this mural of dollars and businessmen and skeletons, that's the Department of Planning at the university. So everyone's really upset. And there's a kettle the lid is being pressed on tight. And I would fear for the future unless our reform comes there, because I think they need it. But I don't think college students want to believe that that's their world. Thank you. Oh, I went a little over. Does anybody have a question or sir?
So why was this 936 what was the reasoning behind it? If it hadn't been done, I mean, the system is still such a mess.
Yeah.
Would it have been better if it hadn't been done? Or would it just take it longer?
Yeah,
to
if
get
I was a
where-
doctor, I'd say first do no harm. And Puerto Rico had a lot of people sitting on a lot of farms that weren't very productive to people that wanted to make a lot of money, but it fed their families, and it kept their culture alive. And 936 essentially took that away. There was an anti-agricultural movement by the leaders, led by Rex Tugwell, who some of you might remember, one of Roosevelt's whiz kids. And so, great, okay, you get the people off the land, so how do you get them work? Well, you do 936. And so they brought it in. But as I said, it was a sugar high. They just yanked it away.
So why did they? What was the reason?
Because philosophically, President Carter didn't agree with it. It was a subsidy. It was a subsidy to big business. All true. It was a subsidy to big business. But there are a lot of subsidies that they maintained and still maintain to this day. But this one was it was an easy kill, as a hunter would say. It's Puerto Rico. It's like Chinatown. It's Chinatown, Jack.
Yeah.
That's my theory. That's what I think is true.
Would it make a difference if Puerto Rico became a state rather than a commonwealth?
It absolutely would. And in my opinion, and it's an opinion informed by reading and such, I think that would be the best benefit for them. Nationhood would be a really bad mistake. You look at all the independent nations in the Caribbean basin, and they're all scuffling, they're violent, and they're losing their, except for serving tourists, they're losing their raison d'etre. I think that statehood is the only way to go.
One more.
Can you tell me how it might have been that Rexford Tugwell had a lease in Arden?
Rexford, I've had some correspondence with a very brilliant guy named Mason Gaffney.
Uh-huh,
And he was friends, Tugwell, with Raymond Moley.
okay.
And that's how Tugwell heard about the single tax and the land value tax. And he considered it for Puerto Rico, but the big landowners who still owned a lot of the sugar plantations said, over your dead body. And he understood that to be true.
Apparently he never built here, but he had a lease.
He was a young idealist,
Okay.
like a lot of people. And he had a connection with Georges for many years, but it wasn't very, I don't think it was very thought out on his part. Well, I'm timed out, and I've got to thank you all so much.